I'm really glad that Amy asked me to do this presentation. I never pass up an opportunity to give a presentation to students at Portland State University based on the fact that as a grad student in biology in 1970, somebody came to our mammalogy seminar and recruited several of us to start working on the city of Portland to protect Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. And I found myself up at the Audubon Society of Portland writing letters to City Council, even though I had never been to Oaks Bottom, but I trusted Al Miller enough to believe him that it was a really significant area. And so that changed my life, really. That's when I started first working on urban nature issues as a graduate student 48 years ago on Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. So I always hope that if I do a presentation to a group of students, whether undergrad or grad students, that somebody in the audience might get excited about the whole notion of protecting nature in the city. So that's one reason I agreed to do the presentation. And I'm hopeful that you will come away from this with some examples in your mind of lessons learned. That's one of my main intents, is to describe the evolution, the history of green space planning in the Portland metropolitan region. But more so than the end result, I think it's the lessons learned along the way that I think might prove to be most helpful to you, regardless of what kind of issue you work on. I think the concepts are transferable. So I'm going to start out by describing what I mean by in livable cities is preservation of the wild. This is the motto that I adopted when we created the Urban Green Spaces Institute in 1999. And it's very intentionally a corollary to an aphorism that some of you may recognize. In livable cities is intentionally a corollary to Henry David Thoreau's "In wildness is the preservation of the world." By in livable cities is preservation of the wild, I mean that if we don't create cities that people love and want to live in, I don't think there's any way we'll protect those pristine areas out in the rural hinterlands. And in order to be livable and lovable, the city, in my opinion, needs to provide access to nature where people live, work, and play, and access to parks, trails, and natural areas. Some of you may be familiar with Metro. It's the only directly elected regional government in the country. And in 1994, Metro adopted the 2040 Growth Management Plan, which includes the urban growth boundary, which directs development inside the urban growth boundary. And the philosophy is to develop regional, sub-regional town centers, and of course lots of transit, and last and usually least, ribbons of green. And that's really the battle we've been fighting for the last 30 years, is to convince planners and elected officials that we need to protect those ribbons of green inside the urban growth boundary. We have done a fabulous job actually utilizing the urban growth boundary to contain urban sprawl. This image shows farmland in the upper portion of the photo, and the lower portion is the urbanized area. And in fact, the urban growth boundary runs right down to the center of that road. But the big question for me has been, what about quality of life, biodiversity, and watershed health inside the urban growth boundary? And to illustrate how we've abused some of our natural resources, I've got a series of images from Cedar Mill Creek, which is probably about 4 miles from here. That's Cedar Mill Creek in 1984, 1990, 1994, and 2002. Imagine you're a cutthroat trout trying to make it in that watershed. And in fact, everything you see in red are streams that have been put underground as the city and the region is developed. And the problem is that planners and other folks have, for too long, thought of the built environment in the city as separate from nature. So there's Mount Hood in the background. So if you want a taste of nature, you get in your car and you drive to Mount Hood, you drive to the coast or up the Columbia River Gorge. When I started working on urban nature, urban green spaces, I was told that urban biodiversity is an oxymoron. Well, it's not. And in fact, the scale that you're looking at, biodiversity is incredibly important. In fact, this is a map showing the various habitat types around the state of Oregon. Oregon Natural Heritage Database, the Nature Conservancy, and other partners mapped Oregon, Washington, and Idaho at the same time, and their pixels were so large that the entire metropolitan region, which you see in pink on this image, shows up, as far as they were concerned, as urban, meaning it's all concrete, there's no biodiversity there. Fortunately, I had a good friend at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Jennifer Thompson, who contracted the people who did that larger scale work to remap inside the urban growth boundary at a much finer scale, much smaller pixels. And the bar that you see does not accurately pick. That should be blue on the left and yellow on the right. Blue meaning low species richness, which they found in the large scale mapping they did. Yellow meaning very high species richness. And if you look at the metro gap analysis, there's a lot of yellow inside that urban growth boundary. And in fact, if you look at Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge in Ross Island, not far from where we are right now, the biodiversity out there is pretty incredible, especially given that it's in the heart of the city. But even the built environment can be incredibly important. For example, 6% of all the peregrine falcon nests in the state of Oregon are on the bridges in Portland. The most productive peregrine falcon nest in the state is on the Fremont Bridge. To the right, you see a chimney at Chapman Elementary School where thousands of Oxus swifts gather every year before they migrate to South America. So that chimney is actually a pretty important habitat. It replaces where they used to roost, which were old-growth trees with cavities. Well, there are very few of those around now. So they, as the chimney swifts have in the East Coast, adapted and are using that chimney. But this is not purely about biodiversity. It's also about access to nature for kids and adults, for that matter. A friend of mine, Robert Michael Pyle, wrote a book called The Thunder Tree about growing up on the Highline Canal in Aurora, Colorado. And in his book, in the chapter titled The Extinction of Experience, he posited a question, a very provocative question. What's the extinction of the condor to a child who's never known a wren in his own backyard? And so we're very much about trying to ensure that kids have access to nature. And I'll get back to that in a bit when we start talking about the value of the system of parks, trails, and natural areas. And in fact, Richard Louv, who wrote Last Child in the Woods, posited a new term that has really caught on around the country with regard to trying to get kids back into nature. He calls it the nature deficit syndrome, meaning that if kids don't have access to nature, they're less healthy, they do less well in school, and his passion is trying to reverse the trend of kids being wired all the time to their computers or whatever. And as a matter of fact, when he was in San Diego, sadly, this is a quote from a fourth grader: "I like to play indoors better because that's where all the electrical outlets are." So we have a big challenge these days to try to get kids back reconnected with nature. As I said, I'm hopeful that I can put forth lessons that we learned over the last 30 years that allowed us to be a little more optimistic about protecting nature in the Portland metropolitan region. One is creating your own reality. As I said, I got involved as a graduate student at Portland State University. I was a teaching assistant in the biology department and got recruited to work on helping protect Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. The city refused to declare it a wildlife refuge, so I got a friend at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to give us 40 of those yellow wildlife refuge signs. And Jimbo Beckman, who you see, a good friend of mine, and I took a hammer, a ladder, nails, and the signs. And the ladder was to get the signs up high enough nobody could take them down. And we pounded 40 of those signs around Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. And within a few weeks, the Oregonian ran a story referring to Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. And eventually, more and more people came to think of it that way. And by 1988, there's the Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge Management Plan that I co-authored with two friends and Jim Shalin, who then worked for Portland Parks and Recreation. The City Council adopted the Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge Management Plan, which made Oaks Bottom the first official urban wildlife refuge in the city. So sometimes a little guerrilla activity can be helpful in your cause. You might want to consider that. Building on legacies. John Charles Olmsted was brought here by the Citizen Park Board in 1903 and produced a master plan for Portland parks, calling for a comprehensive interconnected system of parks, boulevards, and parkways. And as a matter of fact, he included in his survey of Portland areas like Ross Island, what became Forest Park, and the watery sloughs area to the north of Portland. So he, in 1903, articulated the need for integrating nature in the city along with active recreation and, of course, the ability to get around in parkways and boulevards. Interestingly, I will paraphrase a quote from the book. He said, "Formerly we built with our backs to streams. We should build looking at streams, allowing them to carry their natural floodwaters, lest one day there be a hue and cry to put them into large underground conduits." So he was very prescient. Today we're going about trying to liberate streams, to daylight streams, and bring them back up. And here, 115 years ago, he was already thinking about what I would refer to as green infrastructure. Power of the outside expert. I ran into Dr. David Good at a conference back east in 1984. Brought him to Portland, had him speak to City Club. By the time he finished his presentation on all the fabulous work they're doing in London, I had people come up and grab me literally by the arm and say, "We need to do in Portland what they're doing in London." He didn't say a thing differently than we've been saying for 15 or 20 years, but he said it with a British accent. And of course, he was more than 100 miles away. I consider anyone more than 100 miles away to be an outside expert. So he really helped generate a lot of civic interest in our efforts to do what they had been doing in London for the Portland, Vancouver metropolitan region. And one of the most significant things he did was talk about how to go about restoring a really very degraded habitat in a very intense urban environment. This is an image of the entrance to Camley Street Natural Park, which looks like this on the inside. It's just a little patch of ground. From the air, however, it's pretty difficult to imagine what that site is, looking at this aerial image of St. Pancras King's Cross Station. It's the kind of rectangular area along the Regent's Canal. What they did was they removed garbage. It was a tippage area, they call it, and created a wetland, which these kids who live in low-income housing nearby had an opportunity. It was really their only opportunity for access to a green space. Lessons learned. Portland State University has been incredibly important in helping us host a number of conferences, bringing outside experts from around the country and around the world, finding good models. East Bay Regional Park District in the San Francisco Bay Area has, I think, the platinum program in the country. They've got over 90,000 acres of natural areas. We took Gladys McCoy, you see in the middle was chair of Multnomah County Commission. Mike Lindbergh was chair of, commissioner, of Portland Parks and Recreation. We took those elected officials and park professionals down to East Bay to show them on the ground what we were talking about trying to create here. That helped build political support and support among the park folks in the Portland metropolitan region to try to emulate East Bay Regional Park District in Portland. And this is an image, a map of their system, which is just an incredible system of natural areas. And they focus specifically on natural areas, leaving active recreation parks up to the local park providers in Berkeley and Oakland. Maps can be incredibly powerful. We did not know in 1988 what we had on the ground with regard to natural resources. So we flew the entire Portland, Vancouver metropolitan region, including Southwest Washington, color infrared photography. Paul Newman, a very poorly paid graduate student in the geography department at PSU, working with Dr. Joe Porosky, created the map you see on the lower right, depicting all the remaining natural areas in the Portland-Vancouver region, so we could visualize what an interconnected system of natural areas would look like based on this map. Using the media, The fellow in the upper right in the boat, I called at the New Yorker magazine. He had written several articles, a series in the New Yorker called the Experience of Place. And it talked about the importance of placemaking in the city. Called the New Yorker. I asked for Tony Hiss. He answered the phone. It was incredible. He said, "Tony here. I thought it would be an assistant." Tony Hiss answered the phone. I told him what we were trying to do here, and he convinced House and Garden magazine to pay him to come to Portland to learn about what we're doing with regard to protecting natural areas in the city, inside the urban growth boundary. Upper right, you see there he is featured in the Oregonian. That may sound trivial to you, but fact of the matter is civic leaders, elected officials are always impressed when somebody from New York City or London or whatever comes to Portland to learn about what we're doing. And the cool thing was, if you look at the magazine article that he wrote, there is our map, which appeared in a national publication shortly after we created it. Jonathan Nicholas, who's now with Moda Health, was a columnist at the Oregonian, wrote numerous columns about the importance of the work we were doing. And on the right, Steve Dean, who still writes for the Oregonian, wrote an article about Ross Island and how Ross Island Sand and Gravel had reneged on a deal that they cut with our mayor, Vera Katz, to donate Ross Island to the city. That column led to him being Robert Pamplin Jr. to meet with myself, Bob Salinger from Audubon Society, and Travis Williams with Willamette Riverkeeper. And what came out of that meeting was his agreement to, in fact, donate 50 acres, not the entire island, but 50 acres, the most significant part, to the city of Portland. And that's an image of us outside City Council the day that it was transferred to the city. So the media can be an incredibly important partner in any effort you're involved in. Icons are powerful. Of course, in the Pacific Northwest, salmon are. We created the Salmon Festival in 1984. You can see there were about 40 people showed up. By 1990, we had over 10,000 people coming out to the Sandy River to watch salmon and to lobby Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to not allow fishermen, to come in and snag salmon off their redds as they were laying their eggs. Great blue heron, City of Portland. That's Bud Clark on my left. Hosted me. We're at the Goose Hollow Inn, which he owns. He was mayor of Portland, 1986, gave a talk downtown Portland, and mentioned great blue herons numerous times. I went up to him afterwards on the way out of the Hilton. One of the cool things about Portland is elected officials are very accessible. Grabbed him by the arm. Bud, we need a city bird. It should be the great blue heron. He said, whoop, whoop. And 2 weeks later, we had a proclamation establishing the great blue heron as our official city bird. That, again, may sound trivial, but the fact of the matter is, every year since 1986, and just a few weeks ago was the 32nd year I went before City Council. We worked with the staff in the mayor's office to write a proclamation describing what we have done and what we need to do in the future to make sure that great blue herons are going to share the environment with us for the next 50 or 100 years. Another strategy that I've used, I got a volunteer for Audubon, Lynn Cuttagaw, painted a beautiful watercolor of a great blue heron, and we got it painted as a mural on the side of the Portland Memorial Mausoleum. And more recently, we finished the building. That is an active mausoleum and crematorium. The idea behind that, of course, is when people are going speeding along the spring water on the Willamette Trail, they maybe stop and take a look and say, what's going on over there, and maybe actually observe great blue herons at Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. But this is all hard work, and it's pretty intense. One of the things that we need to do more of, I think, is have a lot of fun along the way. And it turned out the day that we got the heron adopted as a city bird, I was at Bridgeport Brew Pub. The brewmaster walked by, asked how things were going up at Audubon Society Portland. I said, great, we just got the heron adopted as a city bird. He said, I just brewed a new ale. I haven't named it yet. Let's call it Blue Heron Ale. Again, may sound trivial, but Bridgeport Brew Pub became the place that we would gather with elected officials, park professionals, park advocates to get to know one another over a pint or a pitcher of beer. And what that did was help us build trust among ourselves so that we could work together more collaboratively. And in fact, I think if of all of the lessons learned that I'm going to cover, it's all about relationships. These are just a few of the people who've worked for the last 40 years on trying to create a system of parks, trails, and natural areas. And the importance of that is that if one of those people called me and asked me to do something, I would just do it. I wouldn't have to think about it. I wouldn't have to ask them to give me a rationale. I wouldn't have to wonder about what their strategies might be. I would just react. And that, I think, allowed us to proceed much more quickly than if we hadn't built those relationships over a pint of Blue Heron Ale. Connecting people to the landscape, one of the things I believe in is firmly is getting people out to get to know these areas. If they know the area, they're going to love it, and if they love it, they're going to help protect it. Coalitions are incredibly important. This is Barbara Walker, who started the 40 Mile Loop Land Trust based on Olmsted's 1903 concept of an interconnected system of boulevards and parkways. Only the 40 Mile Loop thought of it as a 40 mile, but actually 160 mile bicycle and pedestrian trail system. That was an incredibly important connection because we decided that trail advocates and park advocates could work together and accomplish a lot more than if we were working on our own. And in fact, in 1994, we created the Coalition for a Livable Future. And this is an image of Sam Chase, who was then director of the Affordable Housing Community Development Network. And on the right is Sue Marshall, who was then director of the Tualatin Riverkeepers. So we had an affordable housing advocate working with a green space advocate testifying before the Metro Council to convince Metro to pass a bond measure to start buying natural areas to protect them. Sharing the information. One of the things, again, I feel very strongly about is getting information out to the public. We started the Urban Naturalist magazine at Audubon in 1984 or something like that. Utilized all of the stories and articles that we collected in that publication to create two books, Wild in the City, A Guide to Portland's Natural Areas, and Wild in the City, Exploring the Intertwine. And then every year, PSU enters the scene again. Over the last, I think 15, going on 16 years now, we gather 500 people from around the region to share the research that they're doing on the urban ecosystem. So getting information out, getting people to share information, collaborate's incredibly important lesson learned. And I'll just say on a personal level, endless pressure, endlessly applied. That's me talking to an Oregonian writer about the Metro Green Spaces program. And I actually took that tagline, endless pressure, endlessly applied, from a friend of mine, Brock Evans. Because I think it's really critical to understand that very few of these efforts are accomplished overnight. It frequently takes months, or more often many years. So you need to be patient and just keep plugging away. Endless pressure, endlessly applied. It's on my business card, and all the elected officials and most of the agency people that I work with are very familiar with that tagline, having worked on this for over 40 years. Okay, so we have all these lessons learned, put a huge amount of work into it. So what? What are the results? Well, in 1990, we got then Senator Mark Hatfield, who was chair of the Appropriations Committee, to come up with several $1 million that we had go through the regional office, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to Metro to start to jumpstart the Metropolitan Green Spaces effort. And in fact, this is the tagline we developed in 1988, describing what exactly we want to do. Create a cooperative regional system of natural areas, open space, trails, and greenways for wildlife, and very importantly for people. And think about this. We started in 1988 with Metro. By 92, we got the Metro Council to adopt a master plan, Green Spaces master plan, for the Portland and Vancouver, Southwest Washington metropolitan region. And the idea was to connect all of the natural areas inside the urban growth boundary with those areas outside of the urban growth boundary that were also ecologically significant. So it's a very large was it Daniel Burnham said, "Make no little plans." So we're trying to create an interconnected system on a grand scale. And in fact, 2 bond measures produced $363 million that people actually voted to tax themselves on property taxes to go out and acquire areas. Everything in red you see is what Metro had acquired by the early 1990s. Everything in yellow is also owned by Portland Parks and Recreation or other park providers. And it's no coincidence that in 1992, when Metro adopted the bi-state regional green spaces program, which is when the acquisition or the addition of natural areas to the region really skyrocketed, because with that plan we could show the voters what we intended to go out and purchase, and that gave them the confidence to vote yes on those bond measures. And so why do we care about a system of parks, trails, and natural areas? The system drives the economy and tourism, provides access to nature, creates public gathering places, increases property values, and promotes human health, fitness, and well-being. This is actually a really significant recent advent with the effort to create this system, in that Moda Health, Kaiser Permanente, Providence have all gotten really interested because they see the connection between human, psychological, and physical health. A good friend of mine, we had actually at Portland State University recently, Tim Beatley, in Biophilic Cities, chose an analogy which I think is kind of cool. You're all familiar with the food pyramid, which means at the top you don't have steak every day. You want to make sure you're getting all the good grains and the fruits and so forth that are at the bottom of the pyramid on a daily basis. So he posited, what's the minimum daily requirement of nature? And as with the food pyramid, you're not going to go to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or the Amazon or some of these incredible international natural areas very often, if ever. But you are, we feel, in need of access to nature the moment you walk outside your door. So at the bottom of the pyramid, that would represent being able to walk out, see a garden, see a blue heron fly over, or whatever. The system is an essential part of the green infrastructure of the region. We need to integrate the built and natural environments at all scales, from the streetscape to the 2,000-acre Smith and Bybee Lakes. I've got a good friend in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia, Patrick Condon, who uses this in most of his presentations, talking about green infrastructure. Curbs are evil. This is him in Vancouver pointing thumbs down at a curb, which literally is a small dam, collects water, directs it to the nearest drain, which then goes into a pipe and then into the nearest stream or river. Rather, we should build as much as possible without curbs, and in Portland we started using bioswales to infiltrate water rather than put it into the pipe system. A good friend of mine, in fact he's on our board at the Urban Green Spaces Institute, Tom Lipton, created the Eco-Roof program in the city of Portland. So eco-roofs are an incredibly element of the green infrastructure, and they can be incredibly beautiful. Urban forest canopy, another part of the green infrastructure for the city is the urban forest canopy. This is Dr. Joe Porosky again. Now remember the map I referenced quite a bit earlier in this presentation. That large area in northeast Portland looks like there's nothing there with regard to green spaces, but if you remap again at the appropriate scale, all of a sudden that urban forest canopy jumps out at you. And in fact, right here on campus, we've got a fabulous example of that. Incredibly important for ameliorating urban heat island effect, incredibly important for migratory birds. So one of the things the city has done is establish a goal of increasing urban forest canopy from 26 to 33%. I'm hopeful we can actually exceed that. Valuing nature, ecosystem services, the system of parks, trails, and particularly natural areas are incredibly important from an economic perspective. The City of Portland Bureau of Environmental Services did a study in Johnson Creek watershed, and they actually used money from FEMA, emergency management money, to buy that house on the left, which is in the Johnson Creek floodplain, flooded year after year, took the house out, reconnected Johnson Creek to the floodplain, and that's actually helped reduce flooding out in the Lents area. City also did a study which documented by combining green with gray infrastructure, you can save a lot of money in the process. So along the Willamette River in the Tabor to the River program, they saved $63 million simply by planting more trees, doing bioswales, and integrating the green with the gray pipes. Of course, the system we want to protect biodiversity across the urban and rural landscapes and go beyond our region. So we're looking at Cascadia. What is Vancouver, British Columbia, Seattle, Washington, and Portland doing that combined we can protect biodiversity throughout what we call Cascadia? The system connects the region with trails and greenways. Now, when I started in 1982 with a grant from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to start inventorying fish and wildlife habitat in the metropolitan region, I was told by local planners there's no place for nature in the city. It's been a huge battle. That is 36 years ago. Over that 36-year period, we've shifted public opinion and the opinion of elected officials pretty dramatically. This is David Bragdon. He was president of the Metro Council, and he announced in his final 2 years in office before he went to work for Michael Bloomberg in New York City that his goal was, top priority was to create the best park system in the world. So that's a pretty huge shift in philosophy among elected officials like David. And in fact, that led to the creation of the concept of the intertwine. That's the branding. The intertwine is the system of parks, trails, and natural areas, and creation of the Intertwine Alliance, which now has about 170 partners, all working collaboratively to try to expand the system. And in fact, it's 3,000 square miles in the Portland-Vancouver metropolitan region, from the North Fork of the Lewis River in Clark County to south to the confluence of the Pudding and Molalla Rivers, west to the foothills of the Cascades, and east to the foothills of the Coast Range, and east to the foothills of the Cascades. And a couple of the early products we produced: a bi-state regional trail map, and a regional conservation strategy and biodiversity guide. And I want to get back to scale here. As I said, we're looking at a 3,000 square mile area. In order to prioritize what you're going to either buy or restore, you got to know what's out there on the ground. Remember, in 1988, we did the flight, color infrared photography flight of the entire region. That was at a pretty big scale. This is what the green spaces, remaining green spaces, look like if you map at a 30 meter or about a 90, 100 foot scale. So anything smaller than that is not going to appear on your map. If you do it at 5 meter scale, which is about 15 feet, then a lot more green, especially inside the urban growth boundary, shows up. So we are looking at mapping at the 5 meter scale and then using modeling to estimate where, for example, the top 30% of high value habitat in the region, and that's mostly areas outside the urban growth boundary, or the top 30% high value habitat inside the urban growth boundary. So that it allows us to look at multiple scales, which is incredibly important. And in fact, if you look at comparing land covers where we are basically now, if you look to the left, that's at the 5 meter versus to the right, the 30 meter scale. You can see you can pick up a lot more at that finer scale. And in fact, in Northeast Portland, you can even start envisioning how you might go about increasing that urban forest canopy to create connectivity. And of course, you want to look at areas. In fact, Vivek Chandas at Portland State University has done a great job of mapping urban heat island around the metropolitan region. And at this scale, you can kind of combine the work that Vivek's been doing, take a look at this scale and think, well, maybe we should be planting trees in the upper right. And with that, I'm going to close and invite you to go to the website of the Intertwine Alliance, theintertwine.org. Our website, urbangreenspaces.org, you can find out more about what the Urban Green Spaces Institute is up to. And I'm hopeful that at least some of you are excited enough intrigued enough, your interest is piqued enough that you might choose to do your own research or get involved with a local nonprofit. Or a lot of students from Portland State University, particularly from the MERP program, what is MERP? It's the Urban Planning Program, Masters in Urban and Regional Planning. A lot of folks from PSU graduate and go to work for the Bureau of Environmental Services or Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. A lot of folks are over at Metro. So there are a huge number of job opportunities out there as well. So hope your interest has been piqued, and it's been a pleasure sharing the evolution of the Parks, Trails, and Natural Areas program, the Intertwined in the Portland-Vancouver region.